former Browns quarterback, Baker Mayfield, had himself a night against the Philadelphia Eagles on Monday night, which was last night from the time we're recording this. Threw for over 300 yards, 3 touchdowns. Good performance from him. And Derek, with that good performance, of course, the national media makes it impossible for people who are truly diehard Browns fans to actually root for Baker Mayfield. Like, they make it really hard. Because they say stuff like this. They say, the Browns should have never moved on from Baker Mayfield. And as Browns fans, it's tough because there's, 2 aspects to it, right? So with that being said, Derek, what are your thoughts on the Baker Mayfield situation? Like, do you think it was a mistake to move off of Baker Mayfield?
So, this is obviously a topic that I feel like no matter when you bring it up, it's a hot topic, right? Within this fan base, whatever. And it has been for a long time. It has been literally since we drafted him in 2018. Like, in 2018, there was people, saying we should have picked Sam Darnold, should have picked Josh Allen. Like, it's constantly been a debate. It's constantly been an argument. Here's the thing. We are now, in 2024, and the Browns got rid of Baker in 2021, and I feel like now we have had a large enough sample size to evaluate it and kind of relook at this conversation. So be patient with me, but here's the thing, right? People ask the question and people say, oh, the Browns should have just kept Baker. That, in my opinion, is a very emotional reaction to something that doesn't need to be emotional. Obviously, when you look at the Browns' history of quarterbacks, it's a long list of crap. And Baker was the first guy in 2018, came in to a situation where Hugh Jackson was the head coach. He ended up being fired. You have Greg Williams step in and be the interim head coach, Freddie Kitchens' offensive coordinator. Todd Haley also was fired. So, it was a giant shit show from the start. Baker came into a disaster, and in 2018, 63.8 completion percentage, 27 touchdowns, 14 interceptions, and that was in 4 games, right? So, I just want to quickly take a look at Baker's career, and let's look at it, talk about it, and evaluate it as far as why we're at where we're at. Why is Baker playing at a high level? Because that's another thing too. No hate to Baker at all. He is playing really good football, and I'm very happy for him. But I do think this argument has not been fairly talked about, and I don't think all the context has been discovered. I don't think people are fairly evaluating this whole thing. And Tristan, if you want to jump in at any time, feel free, because I know I'm probably going to ramble with this. But let's look at it, right? I just mentioned it. 2018, Baker comes in, puts up a really good showing as a rookie. Is it C.J. Stroud good? No, but it was really good. And especially for the Browns, it was huge. It was absolutely huge. And the Browns at that time said, wow, okay, we got our guy. We know we got our quarterback. And what are we going to do to help Baker? What are we going to do to further ensure that he's our guy? Well, unfortunately for us, it was the wrong thing. And we went out and hired Freddie Kitchens to be the head coach, which I like Freddie as a person. That was a huge mistake, obviously. John Dorsey was the GM. There was a lot of things there. And in 2019, the Browns also went out and traded a first-round pick, Jabril Peppers, and a couple other things for Odell Beckham Jr. This began the downfall of Baker's time in Cleveland, because in 2019, Baker had a 59.4 completion percentage, 22 touchdowns, 21 interceptions. That was in 16 games. Absolute disaster. So you're coming off of a really good rookie season. You do everything you think you are to help him, and he comes out and is atrocious. And I'm not going to completely blame Baker for that, but you have to fairly evaluate. So, okay, 2020, right? This is the season where everybody was like, okay, we need to find out what we have. We have to figure out what we have in Baker Mayfield. Kevin Stefanski was hired. Freddie Kitchens is fired. Changes are made. And Baker this season, 62.8 completion percentage, 26 touchdowns, 8 interceptions. That was in 16 games. Browns make the playoffs. It was great times in Cleveland. It was felt like everything was on the right path again. Like we were feeling really good. And Baker had a relatively good year, right? Things were awesome. Then you get to 2022. Or, I'm sorry, 2021. And this is the year that you have to start making decisions on Baker Mayfield. You've now, at this point, you've had 3 years to figure out what you have. You had a quarterback on a rookie option, which is obviously a huge thing, or rookie contract, which is a huge thing. First year, really good. Second year, terrible. Third year, really good again. Okay, what do we have? Can we get consistency here? And in 2021, it started to fall apart again. Baker Mayfield that season obviously had the torn labrum, messed up shoulder, OBJ drama, the whole thing. He had a 60.5 completion percentage, 17 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, and 14 games played. Now, at this point was when the Browns made the decision to move off of Baker Mayfield, and obviously we know we brought in Deshaun Watson. We're not talking about Deshaun Watson at this moment, but this is when the Browns moved on. Now, why did the Browns move on, right? This is a key part in this whole discussion. Did the Browns make a mistake? One thing that I feel like is very important, Tristan, that gets massively overlooked with this whole thing is the locker room. The Baker Mayfield OBJ drama, blame whoever you want, pick whatever side you want, that was a huge factor in the decision to move on from Baker Mayfield, because you had, at bare minimum, that locker room was split 50-50, right? And you had a group of guys who blamed Baker, and then you had a group of guys that were like, hey, no, it's OBJ's fault. Once you lose a locker room to that extent, it takes a whole lot to get it back. And you had Kevin Stefanski in year 2 at this point. He was coach of the year in 2020, his first year. The Browns made the playoffs. The Browns felt like, hey, we got our coach, finally, right? And then everything starts to fall apart again. So Andrew Berry was brought in as general manager. Freddie Kitchens was fired, and Kevin Stefanski was brought in as head coach. You have new leadership as far as the direction of the team. Guys who didn't pick Baker, guys who not necessarily love Baker, and they were evaluating from a different lens. So the Browns make the decision to move on, and that is what it is. So let's just cut it there with the Browns. What happens with Baker from there? Baker Mayfield obviously has the shoulder surgery. It's a completely weird situation with Baker. What's going to happen? Well, he ends up going to the Carolina Panthers, where he played in 7 games. And he had a 57.8 completion percentage, 6 touchdowns, 6 picks. It was not pretty. Browns, ironically, beat the Carolina Panthers week 1, and that was kind of funny. But the Panthers experiment with Baker. Go ahead.
Real quick. That Panthers game, you want to know how we won it?
Cade York.
Cade York.
Cade York. Which is a totally different story.
Oh, my gosh.
Dude. Absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. But Baker Mayfield, safe to say, was a failure on the Panthers. Like, that was a failed experiment for whatever reason. Blame whoever you want. Baker then goes to the Rams and plays in 5 games that same year. Finished with the Rams with a 63.6 completion percentage, 4 touchdowns, 2 picks. Baker at this point showed some promise. Baker was actually pretty impressive, where he comes in, has a couple good games for the Rams. Looks like he still has something. To what level? Don't really know, but it looks like Baker can play in the NFL on a different team. And then we get to this year, right? Baker Mayfield at this point, who knows, right? It was either if he fails here, he's going to be on College game day, or he's going to figure something out. Like, that's where we were at. And the Bucs this year, Baker played all 17 games, which is great. From a health standpoint, that's great. Which we'll get into with Deshaun Watson later. There's a preview. But Baker finished the season this year 64.3 completion percentage, 28 touchdowns, 10 interceptions. So this is the most touchdowns he's had. This is the best completion percentage he's had in the NFL. Not the best INT ratio. But, Baker so far this year, 4,044 yards, which is 9th in the league, 28 touchdowns, which is 7th in the league, 10 interceptions, and then he has a QBR of 54.4, which is 18th in the NFL as far as quarterbacks go. So, Tristan, here's what I will tell you, and this is what I want to take that information and bring that into this conversation. First things first, when people say the Browns messed up by moving on from Baker Mayfield, does that mean the Carolina Panthers and the Los Angeles Rams also messed up? Because for some reason we're forgetting that.
Yeah, that's a huge part of this story. So I guess first things first, before I go into my spiel, was there any other comments you had before about Baker? Because for me, I've got a decent chunk to say as well. So
I have like two quick things, and then I'll shut up. So I wanted to throw that out there because that's the thing that gets just overlooked is the fact that he's now been on four NFL teams, including the Browns. Two of them being the Panthers and the Rams right after, and then now on the Bucs. So that needs to be talked about as well. That it's not like Baker went from the Browns to the Bucs and he's playing well. That's not the case. So there's that. Another thing, why did the Browns move on? There comes a certain point in time in every relationship, whether it be, sometimes friendships, unfortunately, sometimes relationships as far, people, business relationships. There comes a certain point in time where it's just best for both sides to move on. It's just best to cut your losses and just say, hey, let's just do our own things, right? That's perfectly fine. That's normal. And for the Browns, we were at that point, right? The leadership that we were under was not going in the same direction as Baker Mayfield was. Like, they were fixing this team, whether it be through free agency, through the draft. Did all of it work? No. But relatively moving in the right direction to get where we're at now. And it was like, okay, is Baker a part of this? Or is Baker Mayfield going to be a part of the core of this team to take you to the next level? That decision was determined, I think, multiple times. For me personally, 2019 was the first time where it was like, okay, like, we have to really evaluate this here because maybe he's not what we think. For the Browns, Kevin Stefanski comes in 2020, like I already mentioned, things go well, and it's this up and down every other year. And the Browns needed consistency. They needed stability at the quarterback position. You had a talented team with a talented head coach. You just need to have consistency from the quarterback. And as far as on the field, you didn't have that. Baker was coming off of a big injury, so that's another factor in the whole thing. And then also the locker room. The Baker Mayfield wasn't going to get that locker room back. And here's the other thing. Last thing I'll say. Whether people want to admit this or not, Baker Mayfield and Kevin Stefanski were not on the same page. They did not like each other. And that just is what it is. You can call that a conspiracy theory all you want. They're completely two different personalities, and it just wasn't going to work. So, my final thing with this whole thing is, did the Browns make a mistake moving on from Baker Mayfield? No, they didn't. In that conversation, now, did the Browns make a mistake bringing in Deshaun Watson? That's a totally different conversation. That's not what we're talking about here. But the decision to move on from Baker Mayfield, did the Browns make a mistake? No, they didn't. because A, you didn't have stability and consistency from the quarterback situation on the field. B, off the field, you had division within the locker room, division within the fan base, division within the organization, and division with the head coach. So there had to be a separation. There had to be a point where both parties moved on. And in my opinion, both parties have been better because of it. And that's great. Two things can be true. So I know that's very long-winded, and I know you're going to have a lot to say. But my answer is no. Do I hate Baker Mayfield? No. Am I happy he's succeeding? Yes, I am. Because I think Baker Mayfield is a good quarterback. And I think he needed to be in the right spot, in the right situation, to be a really good quarterback. And I think he's finally found that. So, good for him. But at the same time, the Browns are moved on. We're in a different direction. We're doing our own thing. So, it's not as black and white as people want to make it seem. So, that's what I will say. What say you, Tristan, after I just went on a long rant?
Yeah, I think that a lot of the things that you said were correct. And, a lot of what I'm going to say somewhat echoes what you were saying. Like you said, Baker, year one, really solid rookie year. Year two, very disappointing. Year three, really good year. Year four, not good, and of course had the injury, the labrum tear. The issue with Baker was that, even during his good years, they weren't years where, because remember, this NFL this year is completely different from what it was like for the previous 4 or 5 years. It was a lot of offense. And those numbers are, like, in this year's NFL, solid. Like the year one and year three, solid numbers. It's very, very solid. But for those years in particular, those were middle of the road numbers, like pretty average looking numbers. And so, you had a guy who was very inconsistent, showed that, he couldn't really put the team on his back, right? You had a guy that had, I don't want to comment a lot on in the locker room stuff because I know there's guys that like Baker. I know there's guys that don't like Baker. So, but you had a lot of media attention, negative media attention. You had the Odell situation with his dad, and, you had him talking, saying big things to reporters, like making news, making stories out of the smallest things, just a lot of negative attention, negative emotion in the media. And on top of that, after the Browns had that playoff win against Pittsburgh and we went toe-to-toe against Kansas City, the best that Baker ever looked in the Browns uniform, when the Browns and Baker sat down for contract negotiations, because they sat down for contract negotiations, so the Browns, from my understanding, offered him a deal that was in the neighborhood of $35 million a year. And Baker wanted more. He wanted a lot more. He wanted to be one of the highest paid quarterbacks in the league. And the reality with Baker Mayfield is this. Even this year in Tampa, he's had some really good performances, but he's also had some performances where, like, what was that? Like the last week of the season to win their division, they beat the Panthers 6-0.
Didn't score a single touchdown.
Like didn't score a single touchdown. Like, come on, that's the Carolina Panthers, the team that if they wouldn't have been dumb and traded away the first round pick, like they would have had the first overall pick, and that was wrapped up by like week 16 or week 14 or something like that. It was wrapped up early. Like, it wasn't decided the last week of the season. And so, he's had performances like that this whole year. And what has it shown you? It's shown you that, yes, he has the ceiling that, if he can stay there, that's a great NFL quarterback. A great NFL quarterback. We all know this. We know he has a great arm. We know what he can do, right? The issue is consistency. He's not a consistent quarterback. And not only that, but with Baker Mayfield, if with him as your quarterback, if you're paying him a lot of money, in my opinion, you can't build a Super Bowl winner, because he would take too much of the cap that you wouldn't be able to surround him with the pieces he needs to thrive. And this isn't a shot on Baker, right? Like, he's done a good job this year. He's looked good. I did point out inconsistency, which, I mean, hey, listen, around the league this year, there's inconsistency everywhere. So, maybe I'm reading too much into it from this year, but he had a solid year. I'll say that. But if I'm a GM and if I'm the GM of the Bucs and I'm sitting down with Baker trying to negotiate a contract and he's asking for $40 million a year, I'm not giving him that money. I'm not, because I feel as though if you're going to build a championship winning team around that, you're going to have to be perfect in the draft. You're going to have to be perfect in every trade, every free agent signing you make. No room for error at all. And that's tough. It's impossible. So from that perspective of what Baker is and basing it off of what we saw here in Cleveland, it was the right move, because and fans can say this all they want, especially with the replacement that we ended up getting, because I'll hear an argument for, was the replacement worth it? That's an argument for sure. But, Baker Mayfield, with where we were at that time, the negative emotion around this team, the negativity towards Baker, it was just in a spot where I think we could have / would have killed his career if he stayed another year here. So ultimately, like you said, I think it was the best thing for both sides. And the other thing, during the Deshaun Watson sweepstakes, right, where the Browns were in on it, when the Browns were ruled out as a contender for Deshaun, because remember, we were ruled out, and then a day or two later, he ended up signing with us, right, because we gave him that big contract.
Jimmy came in and said.
Jimmy came in. People tend to forget this. During the Deshaun sweepstakes, Baker didn't really say a whole lot, but then the moment that the Browns got kicked out of it, he was pretty much saying "Oh, I'm not going to play for Cleveland."
Yeah, he put in a formal trade request. If I'm correct,
he put in a trade request. Yeah. I'm almost certain that he put in a trade request, but he at least said he wasn't going to play in Cleveland. He wasn't going to be the quarterback, right? And he tried to pull a power move. And, I also think back to that previous season. He played every single game besides the last one. And it was because in that last one, he decided to just not play. He could have. He very well could have. He just decided not to. And listen, it was a meaningless game. He had torn labrum. Kind of get it. But at the same token, it showed you that this was a guy that didn't really care about the future, because he was so bundled in the now, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's poor phrasing, but it's hard for me to phrase it, but I think you understand what I'm saying here. At the end of the day, we got to look back at where we were in that time. And where we were in that time with the decisions we had to make, it was the right call. It was the right call. And I still stand by it. And I wish Baker the best in Tampa. I hope he gets an extension, and I hope it goes well for him. And I hope he proves me wrong. I hope that he gets paid and he ends up winning a Super Bowl. I don't like, I don't care if I look right or wrong here. It's just my opinion on where I think he was in Cleveland and where I think he is now. So, yeah, it's a complicated topic and complicated decision. But long story short, did the Browns make a mistake? No, no. We got to remember where we were at that time.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing to remember too is like sometimes you got to fall down to get up. Like that's just the reality with life. Sometimes you got to get fired. Sometimes you got to lose your job. Sometimes you got to have your car break down. Sometimes you got to have, a person walk away or whatever. And in the moment you look at it and you're like, man, like, why did it have to go this way? Why did that have to happen? Why did this have to happen? Why couldn't it have just worked out? And then guess what? Lo and behold, you look at it from a perspective of a year down the road even, or like 2 years down the road, and you go, man, thank God. Like, thank God that happened. Thank God I'm out of that job. Thank God I'm out of that situation or whatever. Like, sometimes it takes a really bad thing happening or something that you view as a bad thing happening to end up in a spot that's better and that you're meant to be in. And I think you could say the same thing with the Browns, and I think you can say the same thing with Baker, is if he had stayed, that situation was not getting better. And I think it was only going to get worse. And it would have just kept spiraling and spiraling. And, for Baker, you went to Carolina and fell on your face. And I don't think that's fully to blame him. Like, absolutely not. The Panthers suck. Like that's not on Baker completely. And then you go to the Rams and you show, hey, in a different situation with a little bit more talent, yeah, I can still play a little bit. And that got enough to say, okay, we'll give you a chance in Tampa with Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Rashad White, like a solid offensive line. And he finally found a scheme that I think fits him more, right? Where it's kind of not as structured as like the Browns offense and the game plan of Kevin Stefanski. Like, it's totally different. So I think you have to view it from that standpoint. Sure, as far as how Baker Mayfield played this year, would you rather have that on the Browns than 5 different quarterbacks and, whatever? Yeah, of course. But this is not Madden. That's not how the NFL works. Like, that's just the reality of the situation. And Baker also, as a human being, has improved. Like, he's not as chirpy with the media. Like, to be fair, I've not watched him a whole bunch, but his character has definitely changed. He's learned from his mistakes, and he had to have been humbled to an extent. And that's kind of what happened. So I think, and wrapping up with this, I know a lot of people and a lot of you will have a lot to say on this, probably in the comment section on Twitter, whatever. But I think here's the biggest thing that we should all be able to agree on. It is not clear-cut, black and white as Baker would be better on the Browns right now. It's just not that simple. And the whole purpose of talking about this is to try to put everything in context the best we can. Obviously, I know there's going to be people who say, well, you missed this, you missed that. And yeah, sure, did the Browns do Baker dirty? I think both sides did each other dirty. And, you can say whoever you want is to blame for that. But yeah, sure, I'll go out and say it. Yeah, the Browns moved on from Baker when he was on the team. Like, I think that's a reality. And is that fair to him? Maybe not. But guess what? Where Baker's at right now, he would probably rather be where he's at right now. And I think the Browns are happier without him. Like, I hate to say it, but yeah, I wish him the best. All right, it's going to be interesting because the Bucs have Chris Godwin, they have Mike Evans, contracts on the ending. So what's that team going to look like next year versus this year? Who knows? So it's definitely interesting. But where we sit right now, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have won their playoff game against the Eagles, and they face the Detroit Lions. So where we stand right now is it's a different perspective than in the moment. And I think in the moment, a lot of people had opinions that weren't really, maybe even including myself, but like opinions that you didn't really know the full story. And now I think we're removed enough to get a more big picture look at it and go from there. So hopefully this helps.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I mean, it's a great overview of his time here in Cleveland, and with that, let's kind of move on.